We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on introductions, so I'm going to ask John, Brendan, and Johanna to come on up. As they do that, I want to contextualize this session. A lot of times we think about the commitments as something that you take on your individual campus, but then we talk about ourselves as a climate leadership network. And so we really have to ask what that means. What does it mean to be the climate leadership network? We've been asking that actually since I've been here. We've asked it with staff, we've asked it at the board level, we asked it with signatories. What does it mean to be a network? And the most succinct way that we can use language around this is really what I found from John's book on Connecting to Change the World. And it gives language to networks that you probably haven't seen unless you've read the book. And it really helps frame what we do, or could help frame what we do. So I'm so excited that this panel is here. One of the things we wanted to do was say, are we the only place that has a network? And of course not. Are there other sectors that we could look to as models? And the municipal sector is really one that has a lot of examples and is in some ways leading this network thinking. So they're going to talk a lot about that, which is fantastic. John Cleveland is going to lead the discussion. He's the president of the Innovation Network for Communities and executive director of the Boston Green Ribbon Commission. Brendan Shane is the regional director for North America C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. And Johanna Partin is director of the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, as part of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. So I'll turn it over to you guys. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Tim. Well, good morning. It's a little hard to see you out there underneath the lights. No, this is okay. This is good. It's great to be here, and it's great to be here, I think, for two reasons. Those of us who are in the climate work or the climate business have a pretty challenging time right now, and I think for two reasons. One, every week, the scientific data on the magnitude of the problem gets worse and worse. So we're setting goal lines and it keeps moving on us. And so the enormity of the need to move fast, I think, is higher than it's ever been before. And we've had setbacks, particularly here in the US. We've got an administration that's openly hostile to this work. So I think it's even more important that those of us who are doing this work on the ground start to look outside of our networks and start to connect these networks together. And so I think one of the reasons we're really delighted to be here is to look at the opportunities to connect some of the work of cities and the networks that cities are doing on this with the work that you and others are doing. We wanted to talk a little, to use some of those city networks as examples to show you a little bit about what it means to sort of be a network and what it means to be in the network business. So going to talk a little bit about networks from our point of view, and in addition to heading up the Innovation Network for Communities and doing a lot of work on networks, I staff the Boston Green Ribbon Commission. That's a CEO network in Boston that's supporting the implementation of the City of Boston Climate Action Plan, which has a target to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. And Tim and I have collaborated a bunch on that. We have a higher ed working group. We have 7 higher ed institutions that are on the commission, so I'm going to talk from that perspective a little bit too. And we have with us Johanna Partin, who is the former sustainability director for the city of San Francisco, actually had Brendan's job before that at C40, the North American regional director, but is now running a network called the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance that you'll hear about, which is 20 global cities working on carbon neutrality. And as Tim indicated, Brendan is with C40, which is the large global network of cities championed and started by Michael Bloomberg that are working on climate change. So we wanted to, I know you had some sort of very high-level conversations yesterday about the state of affairs on climate. We wanted to start to bring this down to the practical level. So your mission statement on your website basically puts you in the network business. So the question is, what does that actually mean for you to be in the network business? That your core thing is building leadership networks. A little bit on the background of work that we've done in here. We wrote a book called Connecting to Change the World. Bestseller on Amazon nonprofit. That means it's in its second printing of 3,500 copies. So, and then in addition, we put together a document that's a couple of them are on your table, which is for funders in particular, for foundations and how to invest in networks, because networks are slightly different critters, and you can't invest in them the same way you do in regular NGOs. We've worked with a lot of different kind of networks. Several of them are in the sustainability climate space, but some are in totally different domains. We've worked with a Jewish Leader Network. We've worked with manufacturing CEO networks, networks related to homelessness, et cetera. And I think our experience is that the network principles and the design issues are pretty much similar across. The content area doesn't actually affect the network design strategy that much. This is getting cut off, isn't it? So you can't really see the top one. So I'll just read it. So I think the point about networks is people tend to get in love with networks, but networks are good for some things and they're not good for other things. There are lots of ways to organize collectively, and I think the key is to be clear about what form of organization you have and does it match the problem you're trying to solve. So, you got coalitions, which many of you have been part of. You have, trade associations, professional associations. There are the more general practice community. There are large movements like the social justice movement. And social impact networks are sort of just one version of those, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about, because I think that's what's closest to what you're trying to do. So what does it mean to be a generative social impact network? So generative is that these networks actually, you kind of can't control them. You don't exactly always know what they're going to do because they actually invent their strategy as you go along. They're focused on social impact. That's very clearly what your network is focused on. And they're networks. They're open, flat structures that are driven by the members. And I think that's the piece I want to talk most about as to what's different between being a network versus being a set of institutions serviced by an organization, and see whether that actually is what you want to be and what makes sense to you. So the key about networks is it's all about the members of the network and the relationships between the members of the network. So whenever you see network diagrams, they're always cross-hatched with all kinds of connections. And what you have is you have nodes and you have links. And that's the basic architecture. What makes the network work is what flows between the nodes. And what flows between the nodes in social impact network will tend to be connections and knowledge and competencies, access to resources, et cetera. But what matters is the relationship between the members, which is really fundamentally about trust and reciprocity and complementarity. It's what members get from those transactions. And the networks don't work if the flow is not two-way. And if you get it right, then it has explosive potential. So when is a network better than some of these other forms of organization? I think there are three basic sort of conditions you'd want to work on. You can see that this is pretty relevant to the problem of climate change. When you're trying to change big systems, when you're pursuing multiple strategies simultaneously, and when you don't actually always know what the end goal is. If you're trying to implement a particular practice and you know what the thing is, let's say SEI and what they want to do is green revolving funds, and you know how to do it, and you know, a network is actually not what you need. What you need is an implementing organization. But when you're working on something like climate change where it's not always clear, it changes continuously, and you need high rates of innovation, then a network might be what would work for you. So these are the features you want to look for in a social impact network. Lots of member engagement and activity and leadership, and I'll talk about the leadership problem in a second. And that the main flow is between the members, not from the organization to the members, but between the members. The members have a common sense of identity about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and they see the other people in the network as their peers, and they get stuff from them and they give stuff, and that you have a relatively informal structure. If you get all those things in place, you get some really great potential outputs. Ability to get resources and talent and organize them really fast. You get a really active network, you drop an idea in it, boom, it self-organizes around that very, very quickly. An idea will spread through a network that has good connections, and the networks can grow really fast. So you'll see a graphic a little bit like this in Johanna's presentation. But this is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. These are the folks in cities who run sustainability programs and who, in general, head up the climate work. The little box is the year and the number of members in the network. And these are the number of members who are just responding to the survey. By the way, this network, when they put out a survey, they get 95% response rates from their members. That's how engaged the members are. And look at that. As it grew, the average ties between the members went from 8 to almost 40. So that is now an incredibly dense, connected set of players who could do things they had never, they wouldn't have been able to do before. Another thing we found as we looked at all these networks is that they have 3 different kinds of functions, and it's very important as you're figuring out what your support infrastructure is to make sure you differentiate these functions. So one is connecting, and the value proposition there is make it easy for people to find other people. And I think that's a sort of a core function of a lot of networks. The second is alignment, is that you get organized around a shared set of goals. Now, you are fundamentally an alignment network because your members have signed a commitment. So you've made a statement of commonality, so to speak. It's more complicated to do an alignment network than it is to do a connectivity network. And the third is this, what we call co-production. I think collective impact is some other language that's used on that, where they don't just get aligned around things, but they actually come together and do projects together. They do applied R&D projects, or they do implementation, they build software, they do other kinds of things like that. Each of these levels requires a slightly different kind of support infrastructure, and they're a little bit more complicated than the previous one. If you're going to do a network, if you want to run a network, well, you need to just design it the way you would design almost anything else. You look at this list of elements over on the left-hand side, it's basically the same elements you would need if you had a strategic plan or a business plan for your organization. I think the problem is that a lot of network managers don't systematically enough work through and get good answers to these questions, particularly for what's the benefit to the members, what's the value proposition, and so what do they get out of it, and how do you know that they're getting out of it? So a couple of quick lessons before I turn it over to Johanna and Brenda to talk about their networks. You do have to continuously be worrying about what the purpose is. What is it that you're actually trying to do? What business are we in? And it sounds like a simple question, but when you ask it and you ask it deeply, it's pretty complicated. You really have to trust the members to lead. I'd say this is the most difficult thing for networks that are organized with an organization and staff. The tendency is to basically substitute staff activity for member activity. Once you do that, you have a different beast. You don't really have a member network. The Urban Sustainability Directors Network for the longest time was staffed by a part-time person, 2/3 time, with nothing else. That was it. And they had a budget of about $200,000 a year, and they had 80 cities, and they were having a huge impact. And funders kept saying, no, we want you to staff up. And Julia Partin said, no, if we staff up, then I become the network, not the members. So you really have to be deliberate about basically saying, it's the old open space idea. Members vote with their feet. And if members don't show up, nothing happens. So nothing happens if a volunteer social entrepreneur doesn't say, I want to do this. And then the network can organize resources and help make that happen. But if it's the staff who said, we're going to do this, I want to find members who want to do this with us, then that's really a different a different kind of beast. You have to make sure you have a common network identity, and I think, again, as we'll be talking a little bit later, in your network, the difference between what presidents and executive staff need versus what sustainability and facility staff need is a really important thing. In the city work, it's really what does the mayor need versus what does the sustainability staff need. And I think you got to be really sensitive about whether or not you can have a network that does both of those. You gotta be continuously talking to your members, and as we said, you got to differentiate your activity. And finally, you got to be open to eventually the network evolving into something else. Because if you start working on a problem that's vague and complex and you can't figure it out, at some point in time you might figure it out. And then when you have figured it out, the network is actually not the right tool, and you need to let the network evolve into something else. So in our discussions with Tim, and we're going to have like 15 minutes when we get done for you to have some conversation about this at your table. There were a couple sort of choices that appeared that Second Nature was grappling with. It says, so, are you really a network or are you a support organization? I think it's a good question and a legitimate one. How do you differentiate this value proposition for staff versus the presidents or the executives in the organization? What's the right balance between this connecting and aligning activity? How do you deal with turnover and maintain the strength in the network as your members turn over? How do you make sure the members get engaged, especially across distances? Do you need to think differently about what you do in light of the new administration that really changes the environment? And then lastly, how much you interact with other networks. So Healthcare Without Harm has a great network. Advanced Energy Economy has a great network of corporate players. You have these city networks. Should you be interacting with them, and if so, in what way? So now we're going to get to hear from Johanna and Brendan. And Johanna's going to talk a little bit about Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which I said is a network of urban sustainability staff across, it's in North America, it's Canada and the US, and also about a little subgroup called the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, which is staffed by USDN. And that's a set of 20 global cities, 10 in North America, 10 international, that have said they're going to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. They're different networks. USDN is, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance is focused on carbon neutrality very specifically and very concretely. USDN is focused on all the sustainability issues a city might deal with. So you'll see they work very differently. And in both of those instances, those are both very much focused on staff. The members of the network are staff. Brendan, who heads up North America region for C40, has a different network. His main customer in C40 are the mayors. And keeping mayors engaged and keeping mayors involved is really different than keeping the staff involved. And C40 is now very much in the process of trying to figure out, well, what things do we do for mayors and what things do we do for sustainability staff, and how do we differentiate them, and do we do them in the same support infrastructure, or do we need different kinds of ones? But C40 and the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and USDN really came to the global stage in the COP21 conversations, which was the first time there were subnationals were involved in any of the discussions. And all of these networks were there. And the fact that these networks existed really actually made a difference and it was a valuable thing to do. So I'm going to turn it over to Johanna first, and then she's going to turn it over to Brendan. And then when they're done, we're going to have just some dialogue at the panel to see if we can tease out and expose some additional issues that might be useful for you. So thank you. Johanna?
Great. Thank you, John. Can you hear me okay? I can't see anything.
Yeah,
with
no,
the
you
lights,
can't. You'll get used to it.
Happy Valentine's Day. I'm not sure what it says about all of us that we're in this room on Valentine's Day. I think it says that we're really passionate and committed about our work, but that's not what my husband says anyway. But yeah, as John mentioned, I'm Johanna Partin. I'm the director of the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, which is housed at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, USDN. So I mostly wear the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance hat, but I'm gonna try and put my other hat on a little bit to give you a little bit of background about USDN and kind of how the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance came about. So USDN was created about 8 years ago. I was actually a member of it when I was working for the city of San Francisco. Brendan was a member of it when he was working for the city of Washington, D.C. I believe we were both at the founding meeting in Chicago 8 years ago. And back then, there were only, how many, 30 or 40 sustainability directors in cities that existed. And so we got together and we said, look, if I'm trying to figure out how to get a bike sharing program happening in my city, and I know that Chicago's doing the same thing, and I know that Minneapolis is doing the same thing, why are we all reinventing the wheel? Let's create a network, much like you all, where we can collaborate on these things and get better at our work and get more efficient about our work. And so we created the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which has now grown to 150 cities and counties across Canada and the US. And that represents 73 million people. So it's a significant chunk of folks. And really what USDN tries to do, it's really focused, in John's terminology, is really around connectivity. It's connecting and collaborating between local government sustainability directors in order to catalyze the creation of and the implementation of additional sustainability work in cities. And so that's kind of our theory of change. We think about, the change that we'd like to see in the world moving toward a more sustainable future, and we think the right way to help catalyze that, in part, is by connecting sustainability directors to learn from each other, to share their experiences, et cetera. And so we put a number of things in place where folks can get together around particular topics. They have monthly calls, they have in-person meetings. We've got a grant program where they can get together and meet and convene around those topics, and a number of different activities that helps connect people that are working on similar challenges. You saw this in one of John's slides. So we've been tracking, since we began, how closely our members are connected. And so you can see over time that not only has the network grown to 150 cities, which actually ends up being about 350 individual people in those cities. So both growing in terms of size of membership, but also growing in terms of how well they know each other and how closely connected they feel. And so some of what we've learned about that is that we find that it usually takes about a year for folks to connect, and it takes 3 years for them to get to the point where they feel connected enough to collaborate on an actual thing. What we found is that our least connected members have been members for less than 2 years. And our most collaborative members have been members for 3 or more years, with the exception of those kind of firebrands that come in and they want to start taking on leadership roles. Then they really start connecting on that deep level much more quickly than 3 years. Some other factors that at USDN that we found that influence connectivity are the most engaged. We always say it, the more you give, the more you get out of it. It's a lot of work, and this is basically volunteer time, right, for those that are working on this. It's their job to do the stuff they need to do in the city. And all the extra stuff, collaborating with others, learning from others, sharing their own experiences, they're kind of doing that in their own time. But if they do that, they find that they get more out of it as well. One of the interesting things that we've found is that it's obvious that members have more connectivity within their own regions. And areas that have formal regional networks have collaborated more closely on projects. And those are the ones that are also most connected outside of their region. And so we find that closer connections within a region also lead to more broad connections. We used to find that cities were collaborating more closely with other cities their size. And now we're finding that that's no longer the case. We're finding the Boulders connecting with the New Yorks. We're finding the Sydney, Australia's connecting with much smaller cities as well. And so that's kind of interesting. You're starting to see a number of cities kind of punching above their weight. So those are some of the things that we've learned through the connectivity part of USDN. But one of the other things that we found is while our core has really been around peer exchange and connectivity, we're finding that there's a much bigger growing appetite for moving from connectivity and kind of supporting innovation in certain spaces to really accelerating wide-scale, widespread adoption of high-impact practices. We're really starting to see, okay, that's great. We've been connecting. We know each other. Now how are we going to scale this up to something that really can make a difference in our cities? And so we are starting to move in more of a productivity, in John's terminology, direction with USDN. So that was really kind of the thinking a couple years ago. We were talking with what we call vanguard cities, the Portlands, the New Yorks, the San Franciscos, and I was at C40 at the time. We were having similar conversations with the vanguards internationally, the Copenhagens, the Yokohamas of the world, who were saying, look, it's great. USDN's great. We get a lot of great support from them. C40 is great. We get a lot of great support. ICLEI, there are other city-focused networks that are helping us advance our climate action strategies. But there's really no space for us to have what we were calling the 301 level conversation about, okay, if you're talking about getting to some incremental 20%, 30% increase or decrease in your greenhouse gas emissions, that conversation's out there and it's happening. But it's a fundamental difference if you're talking about getting to carbon neutrality or getting to 100% renewables. And you know this because you're working on this in your universities. And so we got about 17 of those cities globally together who said, you know, we want this space for us to collaborate at that vanguard level. And so we created the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance along with C40 and Inc. and some others with some foundation funding. And CNCA was really created as a global collaboration of cities that are committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% or more by 2050 or sooner, which is really the most ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets undertaken by any cities around the world. These are the cities. There are 20 of them around the world, much smaller than USDN, much smaller than C40, but really because it's focused on complete carbon neutrality. So these are their targets, and you can see for each of the cities, they've got interim targets along the way, but the ultimate goal is to get to somewhere between an 80 to 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 or sooner. Good news is cities are starting to see some progress there, and this is an example. These are some examples of some of the progress that cities have made. So you can see in some cities like Berlin, their greenhouse gas emissions have gone down 29% while they've been able to grow their local economy by 19%. And so it's really turning that whole economy versus climate myth upside down. So as I was mentioning, you know, we've read all these cities' plans for getting to carbon neutrality, and some of them are in the process of rewriting them or making them more ambitious. And what we found was that for these vanguard cities around the world, it's possible to achieve interim carbon reduction targets, 20, 30, 40%, by making continuous improvements in existing systems and services and sectors. However, if you're trying to achieve carbon neutrality, you are talking about a complete radical transformation, a disruptive systemic change that needs to happen at every level across every sector in your city. And I'm sure you're finding this in your universities as well. And that's looking across all of the sectors: buildings, transportation, waste, energy, et cetera. This is one of my favorite cartoons, which I'm sure you've seen. Maybe hard to see, but there's all these complex calculations, and then in the middle it says, then a miracle occurs. And the guy says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. We're focused on step 2, right? Before we were saying, we have no idea how we're going to get to carbon neutrality. And now by collaborating with other cities, you know, I sometimes call it the holy shit network. Like you look at what it takes to get to carbon neutrality and you go, oh my God, how are we going to get there? At least now we've got 20 cities around the world that are having that moment together and helping each other get through it. And so this is a little bit about what we do. We're really focused on advancing transformative change. We're really focused on helping our members speak with a common voice, right? To help, C40's been great at getting cities on the map in the global climate discussions, extremely important right now in the US as we're seeing continued leadership at the city, at the local government level, when we're seeing that drop at the federal level. We also think it's really useful to develop common approaches where they can be developed, right? Don't reinvent the wheel if you're trying to do something someone else has already done. And then looking at key partnerships and fostering a next wave. So it's not just we want these 20 cities to be successful. We want to create lessons that can be useful for other cities that can then also adopt those ambitious targets. And then we've got a fund that I'll talk about in a second. I'll wrap up here. John helped us write something called the Framework for Long-Term Deep Carbon Reduction Planning, which is really a compilation of all of the city's carbon neutrality plans. And it is looking at what does a state-of-the-art carbon neutrality strategy look like for cities. And we thought it was useful to start with that so that we can help cities start to align around, okay, you do have to think about getting to zero net carbon buildings within, and maybe even mandating that within the next couple of years. You do have to start thinking about these things. So we started with that. And then out of that, we said, okay, what are some of the things that cities need help with to kind of build ownership around a carbon neutrality plan? And one of them was communicating about the ambitious targets. And so we created this for the city of DC and for 10 other cities, helping them message what it looks like, how much money is spent, not just by the city, but by residents and businesses in the city on fossil fuels every year. In DC, it's $1.8 billion. Here's where it goes. It leaves the community, and it goes to Russia, it goes to Saudi Arabia, it goes to Venezuela. If you spent that money locally on promoting your local clean energy economy, here's what it could do instead. You could put solar on tens of thousands of homes. You could buy this many electric vehicles, et cetera. The Innovation Fund that I mentioned is our grant program. So it's a fund that we've created with foundation support that helps cities collaborate on actual projects. We give them money for them to go and tackle a challenge and to do that collaboratively in a couple different ways. And what we found was that there is a lot of work that cities need to do that is in the kind of pre-commercialization stage. It's too risky. They can't spend city money on it, taxpayer money on it. And so they really need this kind of angel funding, venture capital funding, and that was a gap for cities. And so we created the fund around that to really advance the riskier innovations that need to be overcome to get to carbon neutrality. And so this is an example of the kinds of projects that we funded over the last 2 years, and we're going to launch another one this year. So again, really looking at that, connecting to co-producing ARC. And so just to wrap up here, some of the lessons that we've learned in that process. Takes a year to connect, 3 years to collaborate. Regional connectivity is important. City size is less important. Achieving interim targets is possible, but it's not going to get you to carbon neutrality. You have to look at a complete systemic change if you're going to get there. This requires working at every level of society. And if we're going to scale innovations to transformative levels, we need to fill the gap in the early stage risk capital. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brendan.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Johanna. Pleasure to be here this morning, and I feel like I'm in the right position to be the last speaker because I think that C40, I've been there about 2 years now. It's existed about 10, going on 11 years. Is sort of an ongoing, a rolling experiment, very much as John mentioned. It's kind of constantly reassessing, looking at a challenge that's getting more difficult, trying to figure out how to meet the challenge, work with different audiences, deliver products that are going to help move the market for cities, for climate action. And so we've built on urban sustainability directors network models, carbon neutral cities, and now actually, to one of John's points, I think we realized the necessity. We've been working together for a long time, but we realized the necessity to work together even more closely, and then to work with other sectors, which I think would be an interesting topic for discussion because the cities have a lot of burden to bear here, a lot of political leadership required, but they need the support from so many sectors all working together. So just quickly, a little bit about C40. So we are, at this point, 90 of the world's largest cities working together. These are cities with a political commitment, mayoral commitment to tackle climate change. As you can imagine, with 90 global cities pretty much evenly in the north and the south, they are widely varied in their capacity and their expertise, in the problems they face, in the current level of climate emissions, GHG emissions that they have to deal with. And so it presents a networking challenge that is considerable. I mean, some of the basic functions of network, of connecting people and things, get much more challenging when you do it in a whole bunch of different languages and trying to bring people together from around the world. But when you can do that, you have a very powerful group, and increasingly one that's willing to take leadership amongst cities, amongst state and regional governments, national governments, reaching out to the private sector and with other partners. As it mentions here, now these cities collectively represent a quarter of the world's GDP. As C40 has been growing and changing over time, I'm going to jump right to the current state, which is our business plan just adopted, started last month, which is to take the current state of affairs, the current challenge that's before cities, coming out of the Paris Agreement, the challenge that's also before all subnational actors, states, business, and the nation states themselves. So that's moving the Paris Agreement, and I'm talking about a 1.5 degree cap on global warming, moving that from aspiration to action. And so our organization, which has grown quite a bit, we're 90 cities, we're probably about 110 staff around the world, is looking at pretty much all of the elements of the arc and the curve that both John and Johanna spoke to. So this is very much about connectivity. It's then about aligning folks on a common purpose and with research and tools to help them be moving in the same direction, and then starting to deliver and very much moving to production, as John points out. So our current chair is the mayor of Paris, and so the way she says this, is that we all face similar challenges, and cities, I think Johanna's point about large cities, small cities, cities east-west, these cities really do share common issues, much like you probably do in the university setting. So we're talking about connecting cities no matter where they are that share common problems to try to work collaboratively and move forward. So that involves convening at the mayoral level. As John mentioned, we represent the mayors. We're led by a steering committee of global mayors. And we started as a mayor network, then spent a few years kind of very much focused on, well, how do you then connect the people who do the work at the city, staff level? So then we're mayor and staff level. And we continue to try to do both. So very important is getting the political leadership together, convening them, having them learn from one another. As it mentions here, the best inspiration is literally one leader looking at what another leader's done, going to a meeting and walking home with an idea which they then want to implement in the city. So then we deliver a package of technical support more to staff level, and so that's initiatives and networks, which is more of the day-to-day connectivity, relationship building. There's direct support in the form of staff on the ground, or more likely technical assistance around planning or around a particular issue. And then there's, within C40, sort of research and analysis that we're providing to all the cities. And this happens across the spectrum, as you would expect, because our cities are dealing with a full range of issues, and so this is issues from mitigation through transportation or energy or waste, adaptation, whether it's sea level rise, heat, or other issues. And very important at the bottom there's a core measurement and reporting element to this. So every city that's in the network needs to be transparent and working and reporting out progress they're making. And that's one thing I'll mention as I go forward here a little bit, is the transition we've made from being sort of membership, relatively open, not too prescriptive, to now shifting to becoming considerably more prescriptive. We also provide a lot of communications and media support. And so this is collectively around, like a Twitter hashtag, Cities for Climate, and action that was done collectively by mayors at Paris and since then. But it's also very much individual support. So it's communication support, media support for an individual mayor who wants to be before the press or wants to take a position in the media. So wanted to spend a minute on the research, and in particular, this research called Deadline 2020 that we just released last year in December at our global meeting of mayors. And this was, we believe, sort of the first roadmap to sort of take the aspirations of Paris. So a year ago we had Paris. It put out a goalpost. And the question is, well, what does that really mean? What does it mean for a city to meet the Paris Agreement and to contribute what's necessary? This is I'll paraphrase Johanna, this is one of the holy shit kind of moments, right? So this is a serious challenge laid down by the global community. And the question is, what does it mean for cities to deliver it? So we spent most of the year after Paris doing research, and it just came out barely in November, just in time for our meeting in December. And it says that we need significant action, and we need significant action very soon, the urgency that John mentioned, in particular in the next 4 years, which for us as an organization of mayors is particularly critical because this means it's not a 2050 thing. This is like, I'm the mayor today, this is my mayor term, and what am I going to do about it? As opposed to other programs that often allow you to sort of kick the can down the road. So just to dive into that quickly, that means that we need to globally be looking at reducing emissions from global averages now of 9 tons down to 3 tons. As many of you know, the US will be sitting, our lowest cities may be sitting at 4 or 5 or 7 right now, I don't know the number, but the averages are in 12, 16, 18, even in urban setting. Big emissions reductions required. And in particular, the next 4 years are critical. So if we look, this again is a global analysis. If we look at these cities, 11% of the world's population today, growing 1 million people a week, globally urban cities. If you look at 25% of the global GDP growing as we go forward, we're going to blow through, if we stick with business as usual, we're going to blow through this sort of available carbon budget, the budget that would keep us under 1.5 or under 2 degrees. By 2030, the budget that we believe cities should bear, the amount of carbon emissions reductions would be gone by 2030. By 2060, just our members alone will blow through the entire globe's carbon budget of all emissions by anybody, just based on the accounting that we looked at for our cities. So there's a very significant challenge, and it's a short-term challenge, very importantly, as well as a long-term challenge. So we know what this means. We quantify, it's difficult to quantify across cities and across countries, what actions or what's being done. We quantify actions that may be smaller or larger, but we roll them up. We know now by 2030 we need to be dropping from 5 tons per person down to 2.9, and then getting to 0 by 2050, and then going negative. Because as cities, actually as universities, as entities that have the ability to go negative on carbon, the world's going to need that. And this analysis suggests that it needs to be accounted for now. You need to be planning for going not only to 100% net zero, but you need to be planning for negative emissions. And so what does that mean when you move to the collective impact and delivering? Well, it means delivering and scaling individual actions in each of these cities, and then very importantly, working collectively to scale those out. So a Chinese city like Shenzhen, for instance, committing to move all of its bus fleet, so 10,000 plus to electric vehicles in short order, like in the next 3 years or 4 years or something like that. A clean bus declaration where 20 or 30 cities come together, go to manufacturers, and see a price drop of 10% in the case of London for a vehicle spec. And this was a couple years ago, actually, now. Just a couple of weeks ago, or last week, many of you may be familiar, those of you who are out west, with a combined RFI that went out from West Coast cities and now national cities, looking at procuring 25,000 electric vehicles. So what is the ability to take an individual action, then to work on it collectively, to say we as cities, we as universities and cities, we're going to be buying 100,000 buses, we're going to be buying 25 or soon 100,000 electric vehicles. What can the market help us deliver? So just some really high-level things, not actually in any priority order, but just from our network, what we found is that 25% of the city actions are cities report to us, and we ask them to report these types of things each year. 25% of what they deliver is coming directly from knowledge sharing. And that's particularly the case where cities have lower capacity and they're relying on a network partner to help educate and bring them along. Cities, and probably everyone else, 3 times more likely to act when a target is set, so the target is important. whether it's an 80 by 51 or now whatever a Paris-compliant 1.5 plan means, which is something we're figuring out in real time. To the basic point, relationships are very critical at all levels, and they do exist at different levels, executive and mayors, technical staff and others. And also that the power of networks is building on the individual strength of each city, because in addition to person-to-person sharing and expertise, it's the ability of each city or each member of the network to focus on an issue or several issues and then bring those together collectively, which gives you the ability to tackle this broad swath of problems and drive together to collective action. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. So I'm going to ask Brendan and Johanna to follow up on a couple of issues, and then we will have a few minutes. And I think probably the best thing to do will be to open it up to the audience and see if we can have some general Q&A. So both of you have worked for mayors, and both of you have worked in networks that are staff-oriented and networks that are mayor-oriented. Can you talk a little bit about, like, what's the difference in the value proposition between the executives at the top and the staff, and how do you manage that in the same organization? Because I think that's relevant to Second Nature and their two constituencies. So could you just give your instincts from your experience?
Should I go first? Well, it's been interesting because it's sort of like two different jobs. I think both of us have sort of two different jobs in one job, which is, you know, looking at the network of cities that are engaged. In my case, I have 15 cities in U.S. and Canada, and realizing that the ability to get a mayor on board to make a statement, to make a commitment, and to rally resources can't be matched, really. The staff can spend years plodding along, working on something that the executive, when they get an idea, can then move quite quickly. And part of what we're doing is very opportunistic. I mean, we try to bring mayors together to increasingly to make the opportunity for them to be together, to share ideas, which then help drive action more quickly. And so you're constantly trying to do that, and particularly when you're looking at asking for cities to deliver plans that are sort of at this point still undefined. I mean, people don't know what a 1.5 plan means. We were just talking before we started up here today about how are we doing this with which cities first. But the ability to get the mayor behind a very ambitious goal like that is critical. That being said, if you don't have the base of support, and I've seen this particularly with mayoral transitions in just the last couple of years, if you don't have the base of staff support, particularly in a transition from administration to administration, but even just based on staff changes, you can't get anything done, even if the mayor wants it to be done. And so it really is a matter of serving both audiences of constituencies and making sure that, as best you can, that you're supporting them and sort of playing them off each other when one can help push the other forward. And I think we're both in a position of wanting advocacy, right? We want this organization to help push decisions. So it is somewhat a matter of letting mayors lead when they can and really encouraging staff to lead when they need to.
John?
Yeah, when I worked for a couple of different mayors in San Francisco, and the 6 most important words I got to utter was, it's a priority for the mayor, right? And then if I could say those words and I got the mayor's okay to say those words, then I could make something happen. And so I think, in the city space, the mayors are the ones that are the most visible, they're gonna get the most attention. When you've got some mayors in a room, it's amazing the number of cameras and media that show up. And so I think ultimately, if you work with cities, that's really what you're ultimately trying to do. And there's a lot of work that has to happen at the staff level to be able to get for them to make the recommendation for their mayor to be there. And so it really is kind of working, I think, at those different levels. And what we found, and the reason why we think it's important to focus at that staff level is because you can have a change at the mayoral level, like Brendan said, and then everything goes out the window. And so if you haven't created that foundation within city departments at the staff level, then all of that work, due to a mayoral changeover is out the window. So we really think it's important to work at both levels on the climate change issue, because without the mayor's visibility, you're just going to continue plodding along. But in order to really ground and institutionalize something, you have to work at the staff level as well.
So mayors are very busy, right? And generally other cities aren't their constituencies. Mm-hmm. So what kinds of activities what kinds of things have you found mayors get excited about enough to go out of their schedule? Because some of the mayors in your networks have spent a fair amount of time. What's the nature of the transaction or the interaction that creates some excitement, some value proposition for them?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, mayors are very different politically, and many of you know this full well. I mean, they're down at the level of a problem. They have to deliver a solution. They have to fix a problem. They can't worry so much about pointing fingers at the opposite political party to explain a situation. So they're very much about getting things done, and they like to talk about that. I mean, I should say first off, they then have this sort of bond. Mayors like spending time with mayors, and that's something to leverage. And they liked talking about what they're doing well. Obviously, they rarely talk about what they're not doing so well. Many of the convenings we have, or almost, I'd say all the convenings, always are highlighting what's happening in that local community. The mayor's the host, they trot everyone out, and they go look at this and that and then the other thing, in addition to talking and sharing ideas in sessions like this. They love to get together. It's interesting, I mean, I have found, and Johanna's now working, we're both working sort of globally. U.S. cities, U.S. mayors have tended to be less inclined to do the global thing. More, we might say, parochial or more focused locally, as a matter of fact. And it's very interesting, and you can watch the sort of interest and excitement grow sometimes as someone who doesn't think that there's a value for them to be out on the global stage or that it's bringing benefits home. But then as they engage with other mayors who are doing it, you can see it, a kind of an awakening happening, right? And all of a sudden, they're super gung-ho, and then you have to try to figure out how to control the fact that they want to go everywhere and say everything. It's usually about what they're doing at home and what they want to highlight, but they really do, there is a camaraderie there, and they like to talk about what they do together and standing together.
Yeah, and I would add, friendly competition is the biggest tool, right? I mean, mayors love to be the first. They love to be the first on something good, as long as it works out okay. But the mayor being able to say, we are the first, U.S. city that adopted a 100% renewable energy target, everyone wants to be that guy. The city of Oslo's mayor spoke at something we co-organized in December. And the number of firsts that the city of Oslo has been able to achieve is amazing. And all the other mayors that were in the room were just going, why? I saw them nudging their staff, going, why weren't we the first? Why didn't we do that? So this idea of friendly competition, I think, is probably the biggest tool at our disposal. And so exposing mayors to the opportunities to be out in front on some of these more risky things, and then showing the rewards that come with if you take that risk, if you show that leadership, there's a lot of positive press, there's a lot of positive attention that comes with that.
I would just add quickly, John, I mean, for the U.S. context right now, things are different, right? And so if you're looking at climate, but then other things, immigration and sanctuary cities and other issues, I mean, there's an opportunity now that mayors are taking at all over, large cities, small cities, different places, to lead in a way that they didn't see the option to lead in before.
So that actually leads me to another sort of network evolution question I think is common between your networks and Second Nature, and that is a network evolving to the point where they can take a position on policy and agree to go and try to use their institutional capacity to go influence policy. So with the mayors, it's probably a lot at the state level, some at the national level, but speaking up and actually sort of stepping out onto the political stage. That wasn't why the networks were formed. It wasn't sort of a core activity, but a little bit with the Paris agreements. C40 has sort of stepped into that domain, and I know the Alliance is sort of trying to figure out where a common voice is one of your. Can you say a little bit about where you are in sort of stepping out on a policy issue and what the difficulties of doing that are in these network contexts?
We've had lots of conversations.
Or is it a bad idea? That's the other possibility.
Well, it's a risky idea. I mean, we've had lots of conversations with our members. You know, it's interesting you mentioned sanctuary cities. If you look at the list of sanctuary cities in the US, it almost 100% correlates with cities that have adopted carbon neutrality goals, right? And so they're the most ambitious, the most aggressive on the climate issue as well. And we've seen cities being willing to kind of step out and say, no, we're not going to let you attack our sanctuary city policy, and to start legal processes to put that in place. We haven't yet seen that on the climate side. We've seen the leadership and the voicing, but we haven't seen any kind of actual steps to get there, but I think we're gonna start seeing that soon. And we are seeing much more interest from our members that have shown that political will already, that they're willing to start doing some of the more risky stuff that would potentially negatively impact funding they would get at the federal level, for example. And so, and that means kind of stepping out on specific policies, aligning talking points for their mayor, and they all have lobbyists in DC and at the state level, getting more aligned about what that means for specific policies. And so I think we're at a unique moment right now where it's time to decide whether or not you want your city to do that, or whether or not you kind of want to sit back. And I think at least for the members of the Alliance that have already shown that political will, I think we're going to start to see some interesting things there on the legal front, the policy front.
I'd agree that it's being discussed and decided right now in large part. In general, as a global network, we haven't gotten involved in policy other than at the global UN COP level in habitat and before the UN, and sort of speaking cities collectively as a voice on the need for action. The U.S. context change in the last few months is a big one, and so there are certainly mayors that are more politically active, groups of them, and so we're in discussions right now about how does our effort globally, and with right now a dozen U.S. cities, it's a large chunk of our membership actually. How do we support them being more active politically? And I would emphasize that part of it, that this is a matter of us supporting them. So this is going to be where the mayors want to go, and then where our support can help move that.
I think that's an important distinction, and my understanding is all three of the networks are in the same place, that it's not so much about the network taking a policy position, but the network supporting its members to be active in whatever venue it makes sense to be active in. Is that a accurate assessment? Yep. Okay, great. So it's different than a trade a chamber of commerce saying we're going to go and we're going to go in lobbying this. So we have about 10 minutes left in this session. So I think at this point in time, we were going to do some sort of facilitated tabletop discussions, but I think given the size of the audience and stuff, let's just open it up to you and questions that you have from a second nature point of view about networks from any of the panelists, and see where it goes. Is there a brave first person? Great. Just say your name and...
Richard Miller, Creighton University. I was wondering, this interesting idea that you have the sanctuary cities, and where the president is issuing policies that are attack on a democracy in many ways, and one of the big issues on the left, the people interested in the common good, is how do you bridge climate with other justice issues to have a real powerful political coalition? is the sanctuary cities, can it dovetail in, so you bring people into the climate issue at the city level? And can those cities also engage with universities in those cities to form a coalition? Because universities are also putting out statements opposing, for instance, the travel ban. Is there a collaboration there that would mutually enforce the strength and power so nobody's on a political limb, left on a limb?
Actually, John, I think you had a question up there in terms of like universities or Second Nature working across other constituencies. That is also a highly active conversation right now, given the federal government stepping back, you know. And I think that it needed, personally, I think it needed to happen before. I think we needed to be moving more toward the universities and the cities and the business and the healthcare and other people, you know, bringing their voices together, let's say around climate. But one of the complications is that it quickly turns into a much broader discussion. So I think we've needed to be working together more closely before. I think it's starting to happen more now. I also think that we both have initiatives which, unfortunately, I forgot to highlight around sort of inclusion and justice, inclusion and equity in climate action. And so there's a kind of a convergence of the concepts of ensuring that climate actions are delivering equitable outcomes for communities, and the connection between that and job growth and economic development and you know, transportation access and opportunities. So, you know, these issues continue to kind of come closer and closer together. It's a challenge for us to figure out what role different organizations play, how just cities speak to multiple issues and how we say it right, how we communicate it right. But I think there are conversations happening right now about business statements on climate leadership and the benefits to the economy and infrastructure and other buzzwords of the day, and then how cities and business work together, how higher education and business and cities work together. So I don't know. It gets very complicated, but I think the more you can do it, the quicker.
I would say that the economic argument is really going to increasingly be the important lead argument. And as Johanna's chart showed, this is not about sacrifice and giving stuff up. The cities that are leading on GHG reductions are the cities with the most strongly growing economies. Vancouver last year, Vancouver alone accounted for 72% of the job growth in the country of Canada. So I think you're increasingly going to see the climate message sent and communicated as an economic development and economic growth message, which then does sort of connect it to a natural additional set of issues. Somebody else? Go ahead.
One thing to add, a lot of our cities, we spend a lot of time talking about the fact that they don't even, the most effective messaging doesn't talk about climate, it talks about quality of life. Right? And we've seen that across cities. You see that when I was working for San Francisco. Even in a place that's very engaged on climate, like a San Francisco or like a Copenhagen, they talk about it as a quality of life issue, which includes economic development opportunities, which includes health and well-being, which includes, mobility as opposed to, a specific transport vehicle. And so I think more and more work needs to be done around that, and I think the collaboration between universities and the academic community and cities on the kinds of information that needs to be gathered to help convey that message and to convey that message well, I think there's huge opportunities for collaboration there.
I think somebody else at the table too.
Wim Miewel, Portland State University. I think it was absolutely fascinating, great stuff on networks. One question I have is, the Climate Leadership Network is actually a lot bigger. It has 600 members rather than the 110 that you now say you have. So I wonder whether you have any thoughts on the problems of creating that kind of a density of people knowing each other. When you have that many people, it goes up, hugely. And secondly, it was really, I think, initially envisioned as more of a traditional membership network where the staff provides assistance to individual members. Do you have good examples of organizations that transform themselves from that model to the more horizontal mutual benefit and mutual connections networks?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't have a good examples for you on that, but I would imagine with 600 members, your ability with the size organization you have and the resources to create connectivity among all 600 members, that would be very difficult. So I would expect that things like the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, which sort of emerged out of a combination of C40 and USDN, that then is a little sub-network that transcends that then really does work very much like a network. I would think you'd want to look for opportunities within the broader climate leadership network to create sub sort of spheres and zones of activities where the high level of transaction among members would in fact be present. It would be pretty hard to do across 600 institutions, given the resources you have.
Yeah. One thing, I mean, sort of the selfish interest in being here is, I mean, cities, as Johanna said, there is this correlation of progressive issues, and as the first question asked, universities are there, are in spades, right? You guys were progressive 10 years before the city governments were progressive, or 20 years, or whatever the number is. So the goals that cities are setting were set by universities a decade ago in many instances, and so I think that the ability of, and I say this in part coming from Washington, where the largest private sector employer base is universities. And it's true for a number of cities, right? This huge, important economic sector. The ability of that sector to move the issue, to raise the issues, and then to push, to advocate for action. So this is, if you've got 600 members, this is what are you asking those members to do? And are they just coming to meetings? We've made this shift. We had a limited network, and they came in, and we helped them connect and learn things and do things. In December, our steering committee of mayors said, well, by 2020, any city that doesn't have a plan that's compliant with the Paris Agreement to go to zero carbon by 2050 will not be in the network anymore. And this is how dire the situation is. This is the capacity we're going to try to build to help you get there and move there together. But starting to ask, if you've got a serious, very serious problem, what are you going to do together? And so those are some questions that all 600 people, all 600 members probably need to be asking themselves. And then it's the 20, carbon neutral guys who are, or you guys were carbon neutral already, many of you, right? So it's not carbon neutral, it's like the next level. Who's going to be the groups within that are going to really advance for their own footprint, but then for the global, for the national and global footprint, the cause of climate leadership.
And I think there's this delicate balance that you're always working as a staff of, this doesn't work unless your members are really driving that, right? If your members are the ones saying, we think we should kick people out if they don't meet a certain thing, that's very different than the staff saying, we're going to kick you out if you, right?
True.
And so there's nudging that the network staff do to the leadership to encourage that conversation, but that conversation really needs to come from the members for it to carry any weight at all. And that's a delicate balance, but one that is really, I think John had it, you really have to insist that it is member-driven and provide whatever support's needed to facilitate that.
So we probably have time for one more question. Yes.
Hi, Mitch Thomas Show.
Hey, Mitch.
How you doing, John? Formerly president of Unity College, and now I'm Sustainability Catalyst Fellow at Philanthropy Northwest. That was a fantastic presentation. The integration of theory and practice and how you think about networks was very engaging and extremely helpful. But this is what I want to say. There are fantastic projects on the ground that are moving forward, and as you suggest, sustainability and climate is not necessarily how they lead. And the Yes Laterras project in Seattle, which is a community redevelopment project that focuses on community support, affordable housing, affordable transportation, anti-displacement, is a coalition among the Seattle Housing Authority, Chase, foundations, and also Seattle University. Vim, in Portland, you've got Living Cully, where Portland State is engaged with the Meyer Memorial Trust, Kresge, and a whole bunch of grassroots organizations that are really focused on community development in low-income communities. Diversity, equity, inclusion come first. and then sustainability follows from that. You've got the Puyallup Watershed Initiative in Tacoma that's also doing extraordinary work funded by the Russell Family Foundation. University of Puget Sound is engaged. So this is happening I just know the Pacific Northwest, but this is happening all over the country, and I think it's a living example of what you're talking about. It's already happening, it's on the ground, and it's a fantastic opportunity for universities to work with cities and all the multiple stakeholders that are involved. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mitch. I would like to end with a pitch for that aspect of your work in particular. I think the advancing of the university as a real living applied R&D lab is as incredible opportunity. It really requires a restructuring of, or it requires you to be way more transparent to the places around you about what you're doing and actually use what you're doing as a way of helping those places advance their broader strategies. But boy, that could have a big impact, even in a place like Boston. It's, you know, I think we're the higher ed capital of the world. We have the most highest density of students of any major city in the world. That could really, really help a city like Boston move their process along, and there are several universities in our place that are starting to do that. So I want to thank Johanna and Brendan for having come a long way here, and thank Second Nature for letting us share our experiences. Thank you very much.